Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Diversity Happenings podcast. My name is Kiondra Broadway, Assistant Director of the Overseas Diversity and Equity Programs here in UMGC Asia, and I will serve as your moderator for today's session. And in recognition of African American Heritage Month, we have a special podcast highlighting one of the most influential African American women of her time, Shirley Chisholm. Today, we will hear from our very own Dr. Cord Scott, who serves as a collegiate faculty member and a subject matter expert in American history. He has been a part of the UMGC community for 5 years within the Asia Division. Dr. Cord Scott is an accomplished author of Comics and Conflict, as well as For Color Combat. He has written for several encyclopedias, academic journals, such as International Journal of Comic Art, the Journal of Public Culture, and the Journal of Illinois State Historical Society. And as in several books and on aspects of cultural history. His most recent work is on U.S. military cartoons in World War I, which was published in the Journal of War Literature and the Arts. He now resides in South Korea. Last but not least, Dr. Cord Scott has served on the university's Diversity Council for 3 years. As he has made significant contributions to the university's diversity awareness efforts. Today, Dr. Cord Scott will share the story of Shirley Chisholm and her impact on equality among women and African Americans. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our guest speaker, Dr. Cord Scott.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in. Our lives are often determined by our forefathers, and in some cases, our foremothers. The struggles of all groups to acclimate themselves to live in the United States sometimes takes on even more importance when someone represents a group that has been underserved. For African American History Month, we will recognize the significance of Shirley Chisholm, for she certainly led the way. As we know, slavery was a government-supported system in the United States until the Civil War. Following that bloody conflict, 3 amendments were ratified to give African Americans rights in the United States as U.S. citizens. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, outlawed slavery in the entire United States. The 14th Amendment gave rights to former slaves, now as American citizens, and the 15th Amendment of 1870 gave African American males, amongst other minority groups, the right to vote. Within these 3 amendments, the first African American to serve in Congress was sent from the state of Mississippi, and that was Hiram Revels, who was a Republican from that state. He was appointed by the Senate to the Senate by the governor of the state of Mississippi at that time. Under Reconstruction, there were some African Americans who had even served as former slaves who were then elected to Congress during the Reconstruction era. But as the Reconstruction era officially ended in 1877, so too did these members of Congress. By 1901, there were no African Americans in either house of Congress. It was not until the mid-1920s that Oscar DePriest was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from the Chicago area. During that interim era between 1865 and 1920, women as a whole were given the right to vote in the entire United States, but were rarely represented in Congress either. It was not until the late 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, that an African American woman was elected, and as she was, the political world changed. Shirley Chisholm was the epitome of the American dream. A child of emigres from Jamaica, she moved back to the Caribbean for her elementary education, where she obtained her distinctive speech pattern and accent. She later returned to the United States, where she furthered her high school and later college education and eventually earned a master's degree in elementary education. She also married her first husband, Conrad Chisholm, who was a private investigator. During this time, she ran a daycare center in the New York area, which served as her interest towards politics. She also served as an advisor on educational matters. Starting in 1965, she served in the New York State Assembly representing the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn. During that time, she pushed for educational reforms as well as better benefits and treatments for domestic workers. She was finally elected to represent the 12th District of New York in the fall of 1968 in Congress. During this time, in American history, the entire United States was embroiled in a variety of movements to change the way Americans worked, from the anti-war protests against US involvement in Vietnam to greater rights for minority groups, as well as a division between older and younger generations on the way forward in United States politics. Ms. Chisholm's campaign put her against men and women who were involved in the core movement, which was the Council on Racial Equality, which was established for much of the equal rights movement. This system was set up during World War II and continued much later on. Chisholm was the first African-American woman elected to Congress and took her seat in January of 1969. She was assigned to the Agricultural Committee, which Chisholm felt was somewhat irrelevant given the lack of farms in the Brooklyn area. However, given influence from others, she re-envisioned her role on this committee and used the position to call for reforms to create the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, better known as SNAP, within the Women and Infant Children, or WIC program, that is run to help poor children have better nutrition and food standards. She also worked with Bob Dole, who was famous within the Republican Party, and this willingness to work with others and learn applicability of all committees to the betterment of her constituents was a success. She was soon placed on the Veterans Affairs Committee, which was expanded because of the Vietnam War, and then later landed on the coveted committees for her, the Education and Labor Committee, on which she served until she retired. She was also a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus in 1971. During the 1972 Democratic presidential primary season, Ms. Chisholm became the first African-American woman to run for president on the Democratic ticket. Part of this bold move was due to Julian Bond being the vice presidential nominee 4 years prior. Bond was from Georgia and was African-American, but while he was a vice presidential candidate, this convention in 1972 was in turmoil, and Ms. Chisholm did attempt to run for the presidential nomination. She did not win said nomination, which eventually did go to George McGovern in that time. However, her impact was long-lasting. It was also at this point that she met with another U.S. politician and presidential candidate from that year by the name of George Wallace. Wallace had been paralyzed in an assassination attempt that year. What was rather controversial about this meeting was, in fact, that Wallace was known for his hardline stance on segregationism in the United States, and so her meeting was very controversial. However, she met with Mr. Wallace to follow the norms established by religious and other civil rights movement leaders to embrace and forgive those who might do others wrong. She continued on with the U.S. House of Representatives until she retired from politics in 1980. More recently, she was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2015 by President Barack Obama. Her contributions continued well after she retired from politics. She taught sociology from Mount Holyoke College, as well as remaining active within New York politics and, to a lesser extent, American politics. While she was a trailblazer, she has even influenced the current generation of African-American politicians, as well as women such as Ilhan Omar, a Democrat from Minnesota, and Ayanna Pressley, two of the four women in the 2018 Congressional Congress known as the Squad. A third woman from that group, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is also from the New York area and represents the 14th District of New York in Queens, which is near where Ms. Chisholm had served in the 12th District. This is but a simple overview of Ms. Chisholm's influence and guidance in American politics, as well as within African-American politics in the United States. And for this, she is one of the many individuals that we should recognize during African-American Heritage Month.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Scott, for that wonderful, wonderful caption of Shirley Chisholm and her impact on not only the African-American culture, but it's also in her time and what she did. I do want to transition over and ask a few questions of you. So with this particular observance, with this monthly observance, African American Heritage Month, what does this observance mean to you and why?
The observance is rather important for a variety of means. As a student back in the 1970s, I hate to say that, my historical knowledge was often based on what we would consider the big moments of history, the movers and shakers, or the major events. In all fairness, I did not learn a lot of African American history at all until I was well into my college years. And for that, I felt extremely remiss, if not absolutely ashamed at some points. And so as I've gone forward in my own educational career, I've come to recognize the great impact of so many African Americans, not just on the history of their own ethnic group, but also for the United States as a whole. And that's why, Miss Chisholm's life, members of communities such as the Tuskegee Airmen, which would tie in directly to American military history, or the 761st Tank Destroyer Battalion, which was part of Patton's vaunted army during World War II. These particular groups had a substantial impact on all of American history, and we oftentimes know very little about them, or we forget of their significance in the greater aspect of history. So I think that that's why this particular events such as these are important, because they bring to light the role of so many different people in American society and how it makes us a better country.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. Definitely agree with that, Dr. Cord. And when you were preparing for this podcast, what elements about Shirley Chisholm's life impacted you the most?
Just the idea that she was literally a trailblazer. I was familiar with teaching government as well as history. You kind of have to shift foci on occasion, and this was an example of where we might be familiar with somebody like Hiram Revels. As I was going further into Miss Chisholm's history, I was aware that she was the first African American woman elected, but not just how influential she was in regards to the foundation of the Congressional Black Caucus, which is thriving now. Unfortunately, Congress is still not nearly as representative of the entire United States. It's far more skewed towards, white males, as an example, rather than any other ethnic or gender breakdown within American society. But it's just the idea that she was there at a critical moment in American history, a time of great controversy, but she brought prestige to the position. And whether she wanted to be that trailblazer or not, because there's a lot of stress being the first one to do something in any field. She handled it very well. And she was, in many regards, I saw her as the epitome of grace under pressure.
That's powerful. Grace under pressure. That's a powerful statement for sure. Absolutely. Yes, definitely for sure. And in saying that, it reminds me of one of her quotes where she says, "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair." I mean, that's definitely the epitome of that statement you just mentioned, that she's exhibited pressure, grace under pressure. That is awesome. So what is one best way that you think that we can continue to increase awareness within the university about this observance, or Shirley Chisholm in particular?
I encourage my students oftentimes in history classes to just get into the events, get into the details of what's going on at that particular time. The 1960s in particular, when Miss Chisholm was first elected to Congress, was an incredibly tumultuous one. You have so many different aspects of American society. Just to give you a reference point, Shirley Chisholm was elected literally 6 weeks after the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. And for a lot of people who were dealing with the issue of race in the United States, probably one of the most famous photos from that is Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who had won in the track and field events for the 100-meter sprints. And this is where they stood at the podium and gave, rather than putting their hand on their heart, they gave the Black Power salute. Now, for some people, they found that incredibly disrespectful, but at the same point, they were trying to bring notice to American society that things may appear to be perfect for everybody, but it's not necessarily for some groups. A comparison to that might be something like Colin Kaepernick's, political moves. Now, again, a lot of this stuff is still very tinged with emotion as well as political controversy as to whether or not he did or did not do the right thing. And this is something that hopefully should spur people to have a serious intellectual discussion about what is the idea of being an American, let alone what is the impact of groups such as African Americans in relationship to overall American history. So I like to think that this serves as a springboard for us to have a better understanding of what's truly gone on for all groups in America, not just what we think about.
Absolutely. 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 So in closing, Dr. Scott, what would be something or the takeaway that you would want others who are listening to take away from this observance?
As far as Ms. Chisholm directly, take her tenacious actions as a sign that we can do anything that we put our minds to. We shouldn't be inhibited by those who tell us we can't do something. We should always work for the betterment of our own society. And sometimes, as I mentioned with Mr. Wallace, she did something by meeting with him that a lot of political and religious leaders, as well as leaders of the civil rights movement, were not particularly happy about. But she said, look, I have to do what's right for my conscience as well. And I think that sort of moral stance is incredibly important. It's something that we at times don't always have a lot in American society. So we need to be to push for what we believe in, and we need to be able to continue to say, I can do this, when other people might be telling us, no, you can't. So that's what I take away from this, amongst several other things as well.
Wow, awesome. Yeah, this was very, very insightful, very powerful, even the takeaways that you just shared there for us to take away as listeners in observance of African American Heritage Month, as well as highlighting Shirley Chisholm and her impact during her time for the different civil movements that were happening. And so just allow us a moment to really step back and think about ways that we can, like you said, tap into a lot of the characteristics of Shirley Chisholm where we speak up. I know nowadays in organizations, we're talking about the speak up culture and having the voice to speak up. And so this really highlights that very much so, when you sharing about her history and her impact and how you're applying it in your classrooms and how you want your students to dig in deeper to the content and the history and the lives of the individuals that they are searching or learning about. So I cannot thank you enough for your contributions, your time in the midst of teaching classes to host this podcast with me to share about Shirley Chisholm for those who are not familiar with her work in her life. I really greatly appreciate it, Court.
Well, I thank you for having me here.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So without further ado, this is going to close out our podcast for today. And with the final thoughts, I do want to leave everyone with a quote by Shirley Chisholm. One of her quotes that she was famous for was about service. And her quote goes like this: "Service is the rent that you pay for room on this earth." So with that being said, especially with us being a community that serves those who serve, all of us play a role in service, and all of us play a role in how we form and shape our environments, from the smallest levels of our homes, our friendships, relationships, community, to our country as a whole. And so thank you so much for tuning in to this Diversity Happenings podcast. Please look out for the next one that will be coming out next month. Thank you all for your time. And thank you again, Dr. Scott, for your time and your service to this awareness initiative. Thank you so much.
Thank
all right.
you.
Very welcome. Very welcome. My pleasure. All right. Have a great day, everyone.